The room was buzzing with quiet tension, the kind that happens when people are waiting for something important but are not sure what to expect. Chairs were arranged neatly, the stage polished, and the piano at the center gleamed under the warm stage lights. It looked perfect, ready for the performance that was supposed to go smoothly. But nobody knew that the evening had already been shaken. The original pianist, someone who had practiced for months, had canceled just a few hours before the show. Some said it was due to illness, others whispered about a sudden emergency. Whatever the reason, the organizers were left scrambling, and the audience had already started to murmur quietly among themselves, unsure what would happen next. She had not planned to be there. She had come simply to watch a friend perform. Carrying her notebook and a small bag, dressed in plain clothes that made her blend into the crowd, she sat in the back, quietly observing the nervous energy of the stage crew and the polite yet impatient murmurs of the audience. Her heart beat a little faster as she listened to the whispers of disappointment. She knew the pianist would not make it, and she felt a strange pull in her chest. Something inside her whispered, "You can do this. You should try." She shook her head slightly, unsure if it was just a passing thought. She was not a professional performer, at least not in the eyes of anyone in that room. But she had spent countless hours alone with that piano, practicing in empty rooms where no one could hear her mistakes, where she could make music that felt real and alive. When the organizer noticed her sitting quietly at the back, they hesitated. They were desperate and had no other option. They approached her with a polite, anxious smile, explaining the situation. "We have a sudden cancellation," they said, trying to gauge her reaction. "Would you, maybe, be able to help?" Her eyes widened for a moment. The weight of the request was immediate and heavy. She could feel the tension in her chest, the sudden heat rising to her face. She knew the audience expected disaster, and she was not sure she could convince them otherwise. Yet there was a quiet resolve in her mind. She had spent years learning, not for applause, not for recognition, but because she loved the music. Now, here was a chance, maybe the only chance, to share that love with people who didn't even know her. The organizers exchanged nervous glances as she slowly nodded. "I can try," she said, her voice calm, even though her hands trembled slightly. In that moment, a silence settled over the room, like the pause before a storm. The audience, unaware of what was happening backstage, shifted in their seats, some whispering, others staring blankly at the stage, waiting for the event to begin. Her heart pounded in her ears as she walked toward the piano. Each step felt heavier than the last, carrying with it the judgment of hundreds of eyes she had yet to meet. She did not rush. She moved deliberately, placing her hands on the keys before sitting down. Letting herself take a deep breath, she could feel every pair of eyes on her, some curious, some skeptical, some ready to witness failure. A few people leaned back, crossing their arms, already preparing themselves for the mistakes they were sure would come. The stage lights were warm on her skin, and she felt the smooth surface of the piano keys under her fingers. It was a familiar feeling, yet the room made it feel strange, almost alien. She remembered the long hours spent practicing, the quiet mornings and late nights where the only sound was her own music bouncing off the walls. This room was different. This room had people, expectations, and the weight of anticipation that she had never faced before. She looked at the sheet music, her hands hovering just above the keys. She knew the first few notes had to be perfect, had to capture attention, or the room would turn against her before she even had a chance. Her mind raced for a moment, recalling every lesson, every correction, every mistake she had learned from. She let her fingers settle gently on the keys, feeling the texture, the cool touch of the black and white patterns beneath her skin. She closed her eyes briefly, taking a breath that felt too short, and reminded herself that she could do this. She had done it before, in rooms that mattered only to her, and now it was time to share it with people who had doubts. The first note sounded soft and clear, almost hesitant, as if testing the water. She could feel the audience lean in, sensing the moment when something unexpected was about to happen. The sound filled the room, delicate but deliberate, carrying with it a confidence she did not yet feel in her own heart. She adjusted her hands and played the next few notes, letting the melody flow naturally. There was a tension in the air, a collective holding of breath, as if everyone was waiting to see whether this simple girl from the back row could truly handle the stage. At first, the murmurs of the audience were quiet, almost respectful in their uncertainty. She noticed some people shaking their heads slightly, a faint smile of doubt or amusement appearing on a few faces. That was okay. She reminded herself that she did not need everyone to believe at once. She only needed to start. She focused on the music, letting it guide her, letting her fingers remember what her mind sometimes forgot in moments of pressure. Each note connected to the next, forming a chain of sound that began to fill the silence that threatened to dominate the room. The stage crew watched in surprise. Realizing that she was not fumbling or hesitating, her movements were controlled yet fluid, precise yet expressive. She could see the way the light hit the keys, the subtle shadow of her hands dancing over the piano. In the audience, some heads began to lift, curiosity replacing doubt. A few older people smiled quietly, remembering perhaps the first time they had ever heard music played well. The kind that spoke not just through sound, but through emotion. She was aware of every reaction, but did not let it distract her. She was playing for herself as much as for them. And that simple truth carried her through the first few measures. Her confidence grew slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the sun rising behind a mountain. She felt the notes resonate beneath her fingers, the vibration traveling up through her arms, grounding her in the music. She no longer thought about failure or the doubts that had filled the room moments before. She only thought of the melody, of the story the music told, of the small truths she wanted the audience to feel. Every pause, every soft touch of a key was intentional. A careful brushstroke in a painting that would unfold in sound. By the time she had finished the first section, there was a noticeable change in the room. Whispers of doubt had quieted. The skeptical looks had softened. She could feel a shift in the energy, subtle but undeniable. People were listening. People were paying attention. She had not yet conquered the room completely, but she had begun to rewrite the expectations that had followed her onto the stage. She sat for a moment, letting her hands rest lightly on the keys, breathing deeply. The audience did not applaud yet. Uncertain whether the next notes would continue the spell she had begun, she smiled slightly to herself, though no one could see it under the stage lights. She realized that the first step had been the hardest. Stepping onto that stage, facing those eyes, risking judgment, and choosing to try had already been a victory. The music was her shield and her voice, speaking in a language that transcended fear. She did not need to speak to convince them. She only needed to play, and each note would speak louder than any words could. In that moment, she felt a quiet connection with every person in the room. She imagined them not as critics, but as companions on a journey she was guiding through the piano. She imagined their hearts opening, slowly at first, to the sound she produced. She felt her own heart respond in kind, filling with a warmth that came not from applause, but from the pure act of creating something meaningful in front of others. It was fragile and powerful at the same time. A tension that she had never felt so vividly before, as she prepared for the next part of the piece. She knew that nothing could guarantee the audience's approval, but she also knew that the music she created was real. It was a truth she could offer, a gift she could give without expectation. That knowledge steadied her, and her hands moved again over the keys. More confidently now, as if she had never doubted herself at all. The room remained quiet, but the skepticism had faded. People were leaning in, listening more carefully, caught in the fragile balance of curiosity and admiration by the end of that first part. The impossible had already begun to happen. She had entered a room full of doubt, of expectation for disaster, and she had planted a seed of surprise. No one applauded yet, but the energy in the room had shifted. She had not yet proven herself completely, but she had proven something important. That courage, preparation, and love for what you do could chuling the harshest of expectations. And as she sat there, hands poised for the next notes, she felt a quiet thrill of anticipation for what would come next, for the journey she was about to lead the audience through with every sound of the piano. She took a deep breath and let her fingers hover just above the keys for a moment longer. feeling the small weight of the room pressing down on her. The audience had settled into a quiet stillness, like the calm after a brief storm, and she could feel their eyes on her with a mixture of curiosity and doubt. Some leaned forward slightly, while others crossed their arms, waiting to see if the first few notes had been a fluke. She knew that the first section of her performance had only opened the door. The real test was in what came next, in holding their attention, in making them feel the music, in proving that she belonged there. Even though she had come unexpectedly, her heart was still beating fast. But now it carried a rhythm she recognized. It was the rhythm of excitement, of anticipation, of stepping into something that mattered more than the fear that had gripped her a few minutes ago. She pressed the keys gently, allowing the sound to flow naturally, letting her body remember what her mind sometimes doubted. Each note felt deliberate, as if it had been waiting to be played at that very moment, just for this room, just for these people. She noticed the way the vibrations traveled up her arms, grounding her, reminding her that she had practiced for countless hours. In empty rooms where only her own expectations had mattered, the audience began to shift subtly. Some heads turned slightly to look at the way her hands moved over the piano. Others whispered quietly to each other, their voices carrying a note of surprise. She did not try to read their reactions too closely. She had learned long ago that music could be unpredictable, that people could feel it in ways that words could not describe. She focused on the sound itself, on the melody and rhythm, on the pauses that gave the music room to breathe. She let herself become lost in it, letting the music flow through her, rather than thinking about how it would be received. The first few notes of this new section were slower, more reflective. She wanted the audience to feel the story behind the music, to understand that it was not just a sequence of notes, but a conversation, an emotion, a shared experience. Her fingers moved over the keys with care, striking each note with a gentle precision that created a sense of calm in the room. She could feel the subtle change in energy as people leaned in, their skepticism softening into quiet curiosity. A few people closed their eyes, as if letting the music carry them somewhere else. Away from the doubts they had brought into the room, she noticed the small details around her. Details that might have gone unnoticed if she had not been so focused on the music. The soft hum of the air conditioning, the gentle rustle of clothing as people shifted in their seats, the way the light reflected off the polished surface of the piano. Each detail became part of the experience, part of the shared moment between her and the audience. She realized that she was not performing for strangers. She was performing for people who were willing to open themselves to the music, even if only for a few minutes. That thought brought a quiet smile to her face, though it remained hidden under the stage lights. As she continued to play, the complexity of the piece increased. Her hands moved faster, but with control and grace. She had chosen this section carefully, knowing that it would challenge her, but also knowing that it had the power to captivate. The notes rose and fell, creating a tapestry of sound that seemed to fill every corner of the room. She could feel the energy of the audience shifting again, their attention more focused, their expressions softening. The whispers had stopped. The murmurs of doubt had disappeared. Now there was only listening, only presence, only the shared experience of music that felt alive and real. She remembered the long nights she had spent practicing this piece alone, the moments when her fingers had stumbled, the times when frustration had threatened to take over. She thought about the hours spent perfecting each section, patience required to master every transition, every pause, every subtle touch. Those hours had prepared her for this moment, even though she had never imagined it would happen in front of an audience like this. She felt a quiet gratitude for the discipline she had learned, for the resilience she had built, for the determination that had kept her coming back to the piano even when it seemed impossible. The piece moved into a section that demanded both speed and precision. She could feel the rhythm pulsing through her body, each note striking with intention. Her fingers danced over the keys, sometimes leaping, sometimes gliding, always controlled. She could sense the audience leaning forward, their eyes following every movement. Some people's faces were filled with surprise, others with admiration, and a few with disbelief. She did not play for recognition or applause, but she could not help but feel a quiet satisfaction in knowing that her dedication was being noticed. Even if silently, she paused briefly between sections, letting the music breathe. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was filled with anticipation. She could feel the weight of expectation, but it was no longer heavy. Instead, it felt like a challenge, a puzzle to solve. An opportunity to connect more deeply with the people who had come to hear her. She glanced up at the audience just for a moment and saw faces that were no longer doubtful. Eyes that had been skeptical now held a spark of interest. Some even reflecting the emotion she had poured into the first part of the piece. That small acknowledgement, even without words, gave her strength to continue. The next section was more expressive, more emotional. She wanted the audience to feel something deeper, to experience the story behind the music. Her fingers moved with care, shaping each note like a brushstroke on a canvas. She thought about the people she had played for in empty rooms, the moments when music had been her only companion. She remembered the joy, the sorrow, the frustration, and the hope that had accompanied every practice session. All of that emotion flowed into her playing, creating a depth that went beyond technical skill. It was the human experience, the honesty of expression, that made the music resonate. She could hear the subtle changes in the room as the audience responded. A quiet intake of breath here, a shift in posture there, the soft nod of someone moved by the melody. She did not rush. She allowed each note to carry its weight, to tell its story, to speak to the hearts of those listening. The complexity of the music increased, but she remained in control, letting intuition guide her hands as much as memory. She felt a sense of freedom, a release from the fear that had gripped her at the beginning of the night. Now, she was fully present, fully immersed, and fully herself as the music swelled. She noticed the subtle connection forming between herself and the audience. It was invisible, almost intangible, but undeniable. She could feel the energy of the room responding to the energy of her playing. People were leaning forward, their attention fully captured. The doubts that had filled the air earlier were gone, replaced by a quiet appreciation for the skill, emotion, and courage she was displaying. She felt a sense of shared humanity, a reminder that music could bridge the gap between strangers, could create a moment of understanding, of connection, of empathy. She continued to play, letting each note flow naturally into the next. The piece demanded focus, but it also demanded emotion, and she gave both freely. She could feel the subtle shifts in dynamics, the rise and fall of tension, the gentle release of each phrase. She allowed herself to feel the music fully, to experience the emotions she had stored up over years of practice. And as she played, she realized that the audience was experiencing it too, even if they could not articulate it in words. The connection was unspoken, but it was real. It filled the room with a quiet intensity. By the time she reached the midpoint of the piece, the audience had transformed. What had begun as curiosity, tempered by doubt, had shifted into engagement, into genuine interest, into admiration. People were leaning in, watching her hands, listening to the subtle variations in tone, absorbing the emotion she poured into every note. She could see subtle smiles, nods of acknowledgement, even quiet expressions of wonder. She did not seek validation, but she could not deny the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her music had touched people who had expected nothing from her. She felt a renewed energy as she moved into the next section, a sense of purpose and determination. She knew that she had captured their attention, but now she needed to hold it, to continue guiding them through the story of the piece. Her fingers moved with confidence, her hands gliding over the keys with a balance of strength and delicacy. She allowed the music to carry her, trusting her instincts, trusting her training, trusting the connection she had established with the room. Each note, each phrase, was a step further into the journey she was leading them on, and she felt a quiet thrill in knowing that they were following willingly. The room seemed to respond to her playing, the energy shifting in subtle ways. The audience's posture, their breathing, their expressions, all were affected by the music. She could sense it, even without seeing every face. The room was alive with attention, with focus, with an openness that she had not expected when she first walked onto the stage. She realized that the fear she had carried earlier had been transformed into something powerful: connection, purpose, and expression. And in that moment, she knew that she had taken the first step in turning expectation into reality, that she had begun to transform doubt into respect, one note at a time. She continued playing, moving seamlessly from one section to another, allowing the story of the piece to unfold naturally. The technical demands were high, but she met them with precision and control. The emotional demands were even higher, but she met them with honesty and vulnerability. She felt a sense of liberation, a freedom that came from expressing herself fully, from giving her all to the music without reservation. The audience, in turn, responded with quiet reverence, their attention fully captured, their emotions engaged, their skepticism forgotten. By the end of this section, she had achieved something remarkable. She had taken a room full of people who expected disaster and had replaced that expectation with engagement, curiosity, and respect. The energy in the room had shifted completely. She could feel it in the air, in the way people were leaning forward, in the subtle smiles, in the quiet nods of acknowledgement. She had not yet finished the piece, but she had proven something important, that courage, preparation, and authenticity could overcome doubt. That music could connect people in ways words could not. That a single person, even one who seemed ordinary and unassuming, could create an extraordinary moment. She paused briefly, letting her hands rest lightly on the keys, feeling the vibrations from the piano echo through her body. The room remained silent, but the silence was no longer tense. It was expectant, filled with the anticipation of what was to come next. She smiled quietly to herself, feeling a sense of accomplishment, but also a renewed determination to continue the journey. The music was not over, and she knew that the next sections would demand even more focus, emotion, and courage. But she was ready. She was present. And she was no longer playing for an audience of skeptics. She was playing for people who were listening, who were open, who were willing to experience something extraordinary. She felt a small thrill as the audience leaned closer. The skepticism of the first few moments now replaced with a quiet curiosity that almost vibrated in the air. She could feel it, the subtle energy shifting, like a tide moving slowly but surely, changing everything it touched. Her hands moved lightly over the piano keys, but with more confidence than before, as though the music itself was guiding her. She had reached a point where she no longer felt nervousness weighing her down. Instead, she felt a kind of clarity, a focus that seemed to sharpen with each note she played. Every pause, every soft touch of a key had meaning. Every sound she made carried a story she wanted to tell, and the audience was listening. The piece began to build in emotion. The melody rose gently, then fell with a sigh that seemed to resonate through the entire room. Her fingers moved faster now, but smoothly, with control and precision that came from countless hours of practice. The audience responded almost instinctively, leaning in, their faces reflecting quiet surprise, awe, and even admiration. She noticed a few people whispering to each other, exchanging looks of disbelief, as if they could not quite believe that such music was coming from someone they had assumed would fail. That was the beauty of this moment. The music was speaking louder than any introduction or expectation ever could. She allowed herself to feel every note, to let the music flow through her as naturally as her own heartbeat. She remembered all the times she had practiced alone in the quiet of her room, when no one else could hear her mistakes, when the only audience was herself and the empty walls. She remembered the frustration, the nights when her fingers refused to move the way she wanted, the moments when tears had come because it seemed impossible to reach the sound she had imagined. But all of that practice, all of that effort, had led her here. And now, standing in front of this audience, she realized that the years of quiet work were finally being recognized. Not through words, but through the way people leaned forward, the way they listened, the way their eyes softened, as she moved into the more complex sections of the piece. Her hands seemed to take on a life of their own. The notes were no longer just sound. They were expressions of thought and emotion. She could feel her own heart responding to the music, beating in rhythm with the melody. She let herself get lost in it, allowing the story to unfold naturally. It was a story of hope, of struggle, of quiet triumphs, and unseen efforts. and she could see that the audience was beginning to understand it, even without words. Their faces were open now, receptive, drawn in by something they had not expected. She noticed the subtle changes in their expressions, the slight widening of eyes at unexpected harmonies, the softening of jaws as the melody carried weight and emotion, the gentle nods of heads in appreciation of delicate touches. Even those who had looked doubtful before now seemed caught in the music. Leaning forward, holding their breath during pauses, subtly swaying with the rhythm, it was as if the room itself had become part of the performance, an invisible partner in the journey she was creating with her hands. The challenge of the piece increased again, requiring both precision and emotion in equal measure. She felt a surge of adrenaline but did not let it disturb her focus. Instead, it became fuel, driving her to press harder, move faster, and yet remain controlled. Every phrase, every chord, every subtle shift in tone was carefully measured, designed to draw the listener in further. She imagined each person in the audience, silently following her through every rise and fall, every tension and release. And in that imagination, she found strength, because she realized that her music was not just being heard, it was being felt. A few small smiles began to appear, almost imperceptible at first, but growing as the piece progressed. Some people closed their eyes, letting the sound transport them to a place they could not describe. Others tilted their heads, listening with an intensity that made her heart lift slightly in quiet pride. She did not play for recognition, and yet there was a subtle joy in knowing that her music had reached them, that her story was being told, that the hours of unseen effort had not gone unnoticed. Every note now felt more deliberate, more meaningful, because it carried not only her skill, but also her passion and humanity. The middle of the piece demanded vulnerability, and she allowed herself to embrace it. She let her fingers linger on softer, slower notes, letting each sound resonate in the quiet space. She imagined telling a story to the people in front of her, not with words, but with sound, letting the melody express emotions that she could not put into sentences. The audience responded instinctively, their posture softening, their eyes reflecting engagement and emotion. She felt a quiet connection with them, a bridge of understanding that went beyond the spoken language. A bond created by the raw honesty of music. She remembered the times when she had been doubted, times when people assumed she could not accomplish something, times when expectations were set so low that failure seemed inevitable. And yet here she was, not just performing, but transforming that doubt into something entirely different. She could feel the weight of that transformation as she played. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Every chord she struck, every note she held, was a statement that expectation did not define reality. She could see it in the eyes of the audience now, the surprise slowly turning into respect, the disbelief turning into admiration. The crescendo approached. The point in the piece where intensity reached its peak. Her fingers moved with purpose, striking the keys with more force, letting the volume rise, letting the tension build. She felt a thrill in that moment, a rush of energy that made her pulse quicken. The audience was leaning forward, their expressions tense, their focus complete. They were no longer spectators waiting for disaster. They were participants, caught in the rising wave of sound and emotion that she was creating. The music had taken over. She was merely the guide leading them through it. She allowed herself a brief, almost imperceptible smile as she navigated the more challenging passages. There was no room for doubt now. Only presence, only control, only trust in her own ability. Every note had meaning. Every pause was deliberate, and the flow of the piece felt natural and effortless. Even though she knew the hours of practice and repetition that had brought her here, the audience seemed to sense the honesty in her playing, the authenticity of her expression, and it touched them in ways that words could not. The room was silent, but it was a deep, attentive silence, the kind that comes when people are fully absorbed in what they are witnessing. She could feel the anticipation, the collective breath held as the music moved from one phrase to the next. She imagined each person in the audience feeling the emotion she had poured into the notes, recognizing the courage it had taken to step onto this stage, acknowledging the years of quiet dedication that had made this moment possible. And in that imagined understanding, she found strength, pushing herself further, letting the music become even more expressive, even more human. The piece moved into a slower, more reflective section. She softened her touch, allowing the melody to linger in the air. She imagined the audience feeling each note in their hearts, sensing the story she was telling without needing words. Her hands moved gently over the keys, creating subtle dynamics and textures, painting emotions with sound rather than color. She felt a sense of intimacy with the room, a closeness that was almost tangible. As if the music had created a private space between herself and each listener, a space of shared understanding and empathy. She thought about the moments in her life when she had played in empty rooms, when no one had been there to listen, when the music had been her companion and her solace. And now, here she was, playing for hundreds of people, creating the same sense of intimacy, the same emotional connection. She realized that what made music powerful was not its audience, its recognition or its applause, but the honesty of expression, the courage to share something personal and human. And as she continued to play, that realization filled her with a quiet sense of purpose. She felt the subtle reactions of the audience, small signs of engagement that made her heart lift. A few people leaned forward slightly, a hand gently resting on a chair, a soft nod of acknowledgement, quiet intake of breath during particularly tender passages. She did not need words to know that her music was reaching them, touching them, creating a shared experience that was both powerful and fragile. The connection was invisible, but undeniable, a testament to the human capacity for empathy, for understanding, for responding to beauty and honesty wherever it is found. As the piece continued, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the emotion she had stored within her. The music became a vessel for both her own feelings and the shared energy of the room. She let the notes rise and fall, linger and soar, creating a journey that she hoped would carry the audience along with her. She did not play for perfection. She played for presence, for truth, for the intangible bond that music creates between performer and listener. And in that focus, she found freedom, a release from fear, and a deeper sense of connection than she had ever experienced before. By the time she reached the conclusion of this section, the audience was fully engaged, fully present, fully connected. The skepticism, the doubt, the low expectations that had followed her onto the stage were gone, replaced with attention, admiration, and a quiet sense of awe. She felt a small, private triumph, not for herself, but for the music, for the story it had told, for the shared human experience she had created in those moments. She had taken the first steps in transforming expectation into reality, and the journey was only beginning. She rested her hands lightly on the keys, letting the sound fade into silence. The room remained quiet for a heartbeat longer, not because they were expecting failure, but because they were absorbing what had just happened. She could feel their collective presence, their attention, their curiosity, their growing respect. And in that silence, she knew that the impossible had begun. She had captured the hearts of people who had expected disaster, replacing it with wonder, engagement, and connection. She could feel the subtle shift in the room as the music began to swell, growing richer and more complex. The melody had moved from gentle reflection to a rising intensity, and with it came a sense of expectation that was different this time. This was no longer the tentative curiosity of the audience. This was full attention, every ear and every eye focused on her hands and the music flowing from them. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing gently but firmly on her. A kind of thrill that made her chest tighten slightly with excitement. Her fingers moved over the keys with increasing confidence, tracing patterns that had once seemed impossible, now flowing naturally as if guided by a force larger than herself. She had practiced this section countless times, but performing it in front of an audience was an entirely different experience. The room seemed alive, almost breathing with her, reacting to each note, each chord, each pause. She could sense the subtle reactions, the audience leaning forward, eyes widening, jaws relaxing, hands resting on laps or arms crossing lightly as they focused. The energy in the room was shifting like a tide, moving from quiet attention to deep engagement. She could feel herself being lifted by it. It was a strange, wonderful sensation. the kind that made her forget herself for a moment. Allowing the music to take over completely, the piece demanded both strength and delicacy, and she found herself balancing the two naturally. One hand soared across the higher keys, producing notes that danced and sparkled, while the other pressed the lower keys with depth and resonance, creating a foundation that supported the entire melody. She could hear the texture of the music, the way the sounds blended and contrasted, the way a pause could speak as loudly as a chord. She let herself become absorbed in that interplay, trusting her instincts, trusting her training, trusting the connection she had built with the room. She noticed the subtle signs of astonishment in the audience. Eyes that had been skeptical now reflected surprise and admiration. Some people leaned forward, their hands gripping the edges of chairs or resting lightly on their knees, their focus total. Others closed their eyes, letting the sound carry them somewhere private, somewhere personal. She felt a sense of intimacy despite the number of people in the room, a bond created purely through the honesty of music. It was almost tangible, as if the air itself had thickened with attention and feeling, and she was part of it, shaping it with every note. The crescendo approached, a point where the music demanded every ounce of energy she could give. Her hands moved faster, more decisively, yet every note remained deliberate. She could feel the tension building in the room, a collective holding of breath, quiet anticipation that made each sound more powerful. She let herself lean into it, allowing the dynamics to rise naturally. Feeling the power of the music resonate through her body, the audience responded instinctively, leaning forward, their eyes widening, their focus complete. She was no longer playing alone. She was leading them through a shared experience, a journey that unfolded with each rising chord and each falling note. Her mind flashed briefly to the moment she had first stepped onto the stage. When the fear and doubt had pressed down on her chest like a heavy weight, she smiled faintly to herself, realizing how far she had come in just a few minutes. That fear had transformed into focus, into courage, into expression. The music had carried her, guiding her through uncertainty and connecting her to the audience in a way that words never could. Each note now felt like a statement, a declaration of presence and authenticity. And she felt the quiet thrill of knowing that she was creating something extraordinary in that room. The intensity of the piece demanded not just technical skill, but emotional honesty. She allowed herself to embrace vulnerability, to let the music express feelings she could not put into words. Her hands moved with a combination of precision and fluidity, each gesture purposeful, each phrase carrying intention. She could feel the audience responding, some nodding subtly, some leaning in more, some with closed eyes, feeling the emotion in a way that words could never convey. She was not performing for applause or recognition. She was performing for presence, for connection. For the simple human exchange that music could create, the room seemed to pulse with the music, live in a way that was almost magical. She noticed subtle movements in the audience, a shifting of weight, a small intake of breath, the soft smile of someone caught off guard by a particularly delicate phrase. These small signals reassured her, gave her confidence, and allowed her to play even more freely. She felt a deep sense of empathy, a recognition of the humanity shared between herself and every person in the room. The music had become a conversation, one that did not require words but spoke directly to hearts. As she moved into the final part of this section, the melody became more expressive, more emotional. She allowed her hands to linger on certain notes, to emphasize subtle shifts in tone and rhythm, creating layers of meaning within the piece. She felt a surge of energy, a rising tide of sound and feeling that carried both her and the audience forward. The music demanded focus, courage, and vulnerability, and she met that demand fully. Letting herself become completely absorbed in the story she was telling, she noticed the audience was fully engaged now, their skepticism long gone. Eyes that had once narrowed in doubt were now wide with admiration. Some people whispered quietly to each other, expressing disbelief or awe. Others simply leaned back, letting the music wash over them, their faces softened, their expressions open. She realized that she had achieved something remarkable. She had transformed the room's energy entirely, replacing doubt and expectation of failure with attention, appreciation, and a quiet sense of wonder. The piece demanded the final emotional push, a moment where everything she had practiced, everything she had felt, needed to be expressed. She felt a surge of determination, a deep connection to the music and to the audience, and allowed herself to give everything she had. Her fingers moved with speed and control, each chord and arpeggio carrying the weight of the entire performance. She could feel the resonance of the piano vibrating through her, through the stage, through the room, connecting everyone present in a single shared moment.